I heard this story from Auggie Wren. Since Auggie doesn't come off too well in it, at least not as well as he'd like to. He'd asked me not to use his real name. Other than that, the whole business about the lost wallet and the blind woman and the Christmas dinner is just as he told it to me. Aggie and I have known each other for close to 11 years now. He works behind the counter of a cigar store on Court Street in downtown Brooklyn, and since it's the only store that carries the liquid Dutch cigars I like to smoke, I go in there fairly often. For a long time, I didn't give much thought to Auggie Wren. He was a strange little man who wore a hooded blue sweatshirt and sold me cigars and magazines. The impish, wisecracking character who always had something funny to say about the weather, or the Mets, or the politicians in Washington. And that was the extent of it. But then, one day several years ago, he happened to be looking for a magazine in the store and he stumbled across a review of one of my books. He knew it was me because a photograph accompanied the review, and after that things changed between us. I was no longer just another customer at Aggie. I'd become a distinguished person. Most people couldn't care less about books and writers, but it turned out Aggie considered himself an artist. Now that he's cracked the secret of who I was, he embraced me as an ally, a confidant, a brother in arms. To tell the truth, I found it rather embarrassing. Then, almost inevitably, a moment came when he asked if I would be willing to look at his photographs. Given his enthusiasm and goodwill, there didn't seem any way I could turn him down. God knows what I was expecting. At least, the very least, it wasn't what Aggie showed me the next day. In a small windowless room at the back of the store, he opened up a cardboard box and pulled out 12 identical black photo albums. This was his life's work, he said, and it didn't take him more than 5 minutes a day to do it. Every morning for 12 years, he stood at the corner of Atlantic Avenue and Clinton Street at precisely 7 o'clock, and taken a single colour photograph of precisely the same view. The project now ran to 4,000 photographs. Each album represented a different year. All the pictures were laid out, sequence from January 1st to 31st of December, with the dates carefully recorded under each one. As I flipped through the albums and began to study Aggie's work, I didn't know what to think. My first impression was that it was the honest, most bewildering thing I'd ever seen. All the pictures were the same. The whole project was a numbing onslaught of repetition, the same street and the same buildings over and over, an unrelenting delirium of redundant images. I couldn't think of anything to say to Aggie, so I continued turning pages, nodding my head in vague appreciation. Aggie himself seemed unperturbed, watching me with a broad smile on his face. But after I'd been at it for several minutes, he suddenly interrupted me and said, "You're going too fast. You'll never get it if you don't slow down." He was right, of course. If you don't take the time to look, you'll never manage to see anything. I picked up another album and forced myself to go more deliberately. I paid closer attention to details, took note of shifts in the weather, watched for the changing angles of light as the seasons advanced. Eventually, I was able to detect subtle differences in the traffic flow, to anticipate the rhythm of the different days, the commotion of the morning, the relative stillness of weekends, and the contrast between Saturday and Sundays. And then, little by little, I began to recognise the faces of the people in the background, the passerby on the way to work, the same people in the same spot, every morning, living instant of their lives in the field of Aggie's camera. Once I got to know them, I began to study their postures, the way they carried themselves from one morning to the next, trying to discover their moods and these surface indications, as if I could imagine stories of them, as if I could penetrate the invisible dramas locked inside their bodies. I picked up another album. I was no longer bored, no longer puzzled as I'd been at first. Aggie was photographing time. I realised nature and human time, and he was doing it by planting himself in the one tiny corner of the world and willing it to be his own. I standing guard in the space he'd chosen for himself. As he watched me pore over his work, Aggie continued to smile with pleasure. Then, almost as he'd been reading my thoughts, began to recite a line from Shakespeare. Tomorrow, tomorrow and tomorrow, he muttered under his breath. Time creeps on its own petty pace. I understood then he knew exactly what he was doing. That was more than 2,000 pictures ago. Since that day, Aggie ain't That was more than 2,000 pictures ago. Since that day, Aggie and I discovered his work many times. It was only last week I learned how he acquired his camera and started taking pictures in the first place. That was the subject of the story he told me, and I'm still struggling to make sense of it. Early that same week, a man from the New York Times called me and asked if I'd be willing to write a short story that would appear in the paper on Christmas morning. My first impulse was to say no, but the man was very charming and persistent, and by the end of the conversation I told him I'd better try. The moment I hung up the phone, however, I fell into deep panic. What did I know about Christmas? I asked myself. What did I know about writing short stories on commission? I spent the next few days in despair, warring with the ghosts of Dickens or Henry and other masters of the Yuletide spirit. The very phrase of Christmas story had unpleasant associations with me, evoking dreadful outpourings of hypocritical mush and treacle. Even at their best, Christmas stories are no longer in wish-fulfillment dreams. Fairy tales for adults, and I'll be damned if I'd ever allow myself to write something like that. And yet, how could anybody propose to write an unsentimental Christmas story? There was a contradiction in terms, and a possibility, an out-and-out conundrum. One might just as well try to imagine a racehorse without legs, or a sparrow without wings. I got nowhere. On Thursday, I went out for a long walk, hoping the air would clear my head. Just past noon, I stopped at the cigar store to replenish my supply, and there was Aggie, standing behind the counter as always. He was asking me how I was, without really meaning to. I found myself unburdening my troubles to him. A Christmas story? He said after I'd finished. Is that all? If you buy me lunch, my friend, I'll tell you the best Christmas story you've ever heard, and I guarantee every word of it is true. We walked down the block to Jack's, cramped boisterous delicatessens, with good pastorine sandwiches and photographs of old Dodgers teams hanging on the walls. We found a table, in fact ordered our food, then Aggie launched into his story. It was the summer of '72, he said. A kid came in one morning and started stealing things from the store. He must have been like 19 or 20, and I don't think I've seen a more pathetic shoplifter in my life. He's standing by the rack of paperbacks along the far wall and stuffing books into the pockets of his raincoat. It was crowded around the corner. Just then, I didn't see him at first, but once I noticed what he was up to, I started to shout. He took up like a jackrabbit, and by the time I managed to get out beneath the counter, he was already tearing at Atlantic Avenue. I chased after him for about half a block, and then I gave up. He dropped something along the way, and since I didn't feel like running anymore, I bent down to see what it was. It turned out to be his wallet. There wasn't any money inside, but his driver's license was there with 3 or 4 snapshots. I suppose I could have called the cops and had him arrested. I had his name and address on the license. I felt kind of sorry for him. He was just a measly little punk, and once I looked at those pictures in the wallet, I couldn't bring myself to feel angry at him. Robert Goodwin, that was his name. In one of the pictures I remember, he was standing with his arm around his mother or grandmother. In another one, he was sitting at age 9 or 10, dressed in a baseball uniform with a big smile on his face. I just didn't have the heart. He was probably on dope now, I figured. A poor kid from Brooklyn without much going on for him. And who cared about a couple of flashy paperbacks anyway? So I held on to the wallet. Every once in a while I'd get a little urge to send it back to him. But I kept delaying and never did anything about it. Then Christmas rolls around and I'm stuck with nothing to do. The boss usually invites me over to his house to spend the day. But that year his family were down in Florida visiting relatives. So I'm sitting in my little apartment that morning feeling sorry for myself. And then I see Robert's Goodwin's wallet lying on a shelf in the kitchen. I figure, what the hell? And why not do something nice once? So I put on my coat and got to return the wallet in person. The address was over in Burham Hill, somewhere in the projects. It was freezing out that day. I remember getting lost a few times trying to find the right building. Everything looks the same in that place, and you keep going over the same ground thinking you've got somewhere. Anyway, I finally get to the apartment I'm looking for and ring the bell. Nothing happens. I assume nobody's there, but I try again just to make sure. I wait a little longer, and just when I'm about to give up, I hear someone shuffling to the door. An old woman's voice asks who's there. I say I'm looking for Robert. Is that you, Robert? The old woman says, and she undoes about 15 locks and opens the door. She has to be at least 80, maybe 90, and the first thing I notice about her, she's blind. I knew you'd come, Robert, she says. I knew you won't forget your Granny Ethel on Christmas. And then she opens her arms and is about to hug me. I didn't have much time to think, you understand. And I had to say something real fast. And before I knew what was happening, I could hear the words coming out of my mouth. That's all right, Granny Ethel, I said. I came back to see you on Christmas. Don't ask me why I did it. I don't have any idea. Maybe I didn't want to disappoint her or something. I don't know. It just came out that way, and then this old woman was suddenly hugging me there in front of the door, and I was hugging her back. I didn't exactly say that I was her grandson. Not in so many words, at least. That was the implication. I wasn't trying to trick her, though. It was like a game we both decided to play without having discussed the rules. I meant that woman knew I wasn't her grandson, Robert. She's old and dotty, but she wasn't so far gone she couldn't tell the difference between a stranger and her own flesh and blood. But I made her happy to pretend. And since I had nothing else better to do anyway, I was happy to go along with it. So we went into the apartment, spent the day together. The place was a real dump, I might add. But what else can you expect from a blind woman who does her own housekeeping? Every time she asked me a question about how I was, I would lie to her. I told her I'd found a good job working in a cigar store. And I told her I was about to get married. I told her 100 pretty stories, and she made me like she believed every one of them. That's fine, Robert, she would say, nodding head and smiling. I always knew things would work out for you. After a while, I started getting pretty hungry. There didn't seem to be much food in the house. I went out to a store in the neighbourhood and bought tobacco and mess of stuff. A pre-cooked chicken, a vegetable soup, a bucket of potato salad, a chocolate cake, all kinds of things. Ethel had a couple of bottles of wine stashed in her bedroom, so between us we managed to put together a fairly decent Christmas dinner. We both got a little tipsy from the wine, I remember. And after the meal was over, we went to sit in the living room where the chairs were more comfortable. I had to take a pee, so I excused myself and went out to the bathroom down the hall. That's where things took another turn. It was ditzy enough doing my little jig as Ethel's grandson, but what I did next was positively crazy, and I've never forgiven myself for it. I go into the bathroom and stacked up against the wall next to the shower. I see a pile of 6 or 7 cameras, brand new 35mm cameras, still in the boxes, top quality merchandise. I figure this is the work of the real Robert, a storage place for one of his recent hauls. I've never taken a picture in my life. I've certainly never stolen anything, but the moment I see those cameras sitting in the bathroom, I decide I want one myself. Just like that. And without even stopping to think about it, I took one of the boxes under my arm and go back to the living room. Wouldn't have been gone for more than a few minutes, but in that time Granny Ethel had fallen asleep in a chair. I went into the kitchen to wash the dishes, and she slept through the whole racket, snoring like a baby. There didn't seem to be any point to disturb her, so I decided to leave. I couldn't even write a note saying goodbye, seeing she was blind and all, so I just left. I put her grandson's wallet on the table, picked up the camera again and walked out of the apartment, and that's the end of the story. Did you ever go back to see her, I asked. Once, he said, about 3 or 4 months later. I felt so bad about stealing the camera. I hadn't even used it yet. I finally made up my mind to return it, but Ethel wasn't there anymore. I don't know what happened to her. It was somebody else had moved into the apartment and he couldn't tell me where she was. She probably died. Yeah, probably. Which means she spent her last Christmas with you. I guess so. I never thought it that way. It was a good deed, Aggie. Nice thing you did for her. I lied to her and then I stole from her. I don't see how you call that a good deed. You made her happy, and the camera was stolen anyway. It's not as if the person you took it from really owned it. Anything for that, April? I wouldn't say that. At least you put your camera to good use. I know you've got your Christmas story, don't you? Yes, I said, I suppose I do. I paused for a moment, studying Aggie as a wicked grin spread across my face. Couldn't be sure, but the look in his eyes was so mysterious or fraught, with the glow of some inner delight. It suddenly occurred to me that he'd made the whole thing up. I was about to ask him if he'd put me on, then I realised he would never tell. I'd been tricked into believing him, and that was the only thing that mattered. As long as there's one person left to believe it, there's no story that can't be true. You've been an ace, Aggie, I said. Thanks for being so helpful. Any time, he answered, still looking at me with an analytical light in his eyes. After all, you cannot share your secrets with your friends. What kind of friend are you? Just put it the way I told you, and you don't owe me a thing. Except the lunch. That's right, except the lunch. I returned Aggie's smile with a smile of my own, then called out to the waiter and asked for the check.